Welcome to my reaction and educational series on the show Silicon Valley, one of my favorite series, television properties on the whole culture and journey of being a startup founder. We're on season 1, episode 2. Spoilers ahead. The name of this episode is called Cap Table, and we are going to be talking about cap tables, specifically when it comes to dealing with co-founders. For those of you who may not be familiar, co-founders are the ones that help co-found your startup. They're usually majority owners of your startup. They get a lot of shares, which is going to be a theme of this episode. Once again, spoilers ahead. We'll be talking about that. And I'm going to be talking about the reason I don't like co-founders, but I love co-founders. In fact, I love to hate or hate to love co-founders. It's a love-hate thing. And there are lots of reasons why. And this episode is really great to show all founders out there what you're going to be dealing with when it comes to co-founders and all that jazz. Let's jump right into it. Before we continue, I'm going to be sharing something. We're going to go a little meta with this series, and we have our own startup that I'm going to be featuring and working through, and that is an app called Social Popcorn, launched by one of my friends and a founder, part of the startups.com community, Paul. And it's going to be an interesting way that we're going to look at startups and compare. Paul is the founder, and he's created something called Social Popcorn app, launched the MVP, and I've been using the MVP to watch this series and make my notes. And if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to explain how you can join me on this journey. Social Popcorn app. Let's continue. So here we go. We're starting off, and in the first episode, Richard gets a deal from Peter Gregory, $200,000 for 5% of the company. They show up at the office and they're talking to him, and the thing of the cap table starts to show up. And what is a cap table? A cap table is basically how your company is organized and who owns what shares. So it's the capitalization table in terms of who's invested what, how many percent does each co-founder or founder own. And in this case, the issue comes up where this gentleman, Erlich Bachman, who we've talked about right here in the background, he owns 10% of the company for letting the boys of Pied Piper live in his quote incubator, which is just a dingy house in Silicon Valley, and he gets 10% in trade for basically rent is what happens there. And Peter Gregory, the investor here, right here, has issues with that and basically confronts Richard and says, you gave this person 10% of your company for a place to live, and I'm giving you $200,000 for 5% of the company. So cash is king, obviously. Peter Gregory loses it and says, you better get your act together. Go. I need a business plan. I need your cap table, and you're going to have to defend the cap table. What does that mean? It means you're going to have to justify the decisions of all the equity that you have given away. And I have a personal horror story to talk about later in this review. Let's just kind of jump right into or keep going in terms of the action and for entertainment's sake. Richard and Erlich Bachman are talking, and basically Richard confronts Erlich and is like, you're not an equal founder. You're not a co-founder. You just have 10% of the company, when in actuality, 10% is kind of the threshold that you would give co-founders. You wouldn't give more than 5% to employees, et cetera, et cetera. So either Erlich's a major investor or he's considered a co-founder. That's neither here nor there at this point in time. All that to say, be careful. If you're a founder, giving away equity in the company in the beginning may seem really cheap because it's not worth anything, but it can become expensive in the long run. This is what's happening. So now Richard has to deal with his friend, Bighetti, or I forgot his name, but they call him Big Head, and his last name is Bighetti. And they're talking and they're really good friends. Now, this interesting social dynamic starts to happen because Richard has started this company with his friends because that's what founders do, right? They have friends and you start companies together and you're basically co-founders. And we could actually say Biggetti is legitimately a co-founder because he co-founded the company Pied Piper with Richard. This gets complicated. And then we have this storyline where our gentleman Jared shows up, and what happens is he is now interested and wants to join Pied Piper because he sees the vision. Remember, with the programmers, he saw the code. So Jared shows up, which is going to play an interesting and important key part and a lesson when it comes to co-founders and cap tables and all that good stuff. And as a celebration, I think Ehrlich invites this worker, this dancer named Mochaccino. That's it, Mochaccino. I bring this up because I want to point out this is some of the stuff that I just didn't enjoy about the show. She turns out to be quite a savvy character. I don't really enjoy these parts of the show, but it kind of gets into the whole geeky people and there's this whole thing about about, let's just say, arousal and how the boys would feel about it, basically at living in a house with all these other guys and being aroused around each other, etc. It's a running gag and kind of the schlocky, more of the gutter type humor that happens throughout the show. And this is going to be a regular theme where there's just some things that don't hit for me, but I can overlook them because the rest of the show is pretty darn entertaining. So then what happens is, and this is, I always recommend, what Jared does is because he has the skills to actually build a business plan, financial model, et cetera, and brings these complementary skills to Richard's skill set as the CEO, as he's worrying about product. Well, what happens is Jared says, we need to sit down and we need to interview everybody and make some decisions on the cap table. And what happens is they're leaning into this whole CEO thing, but there's a lesson here. When you are dealing with these situations, run a process, run a formal process and treat everybody like a real company so that, social contracts and personal dynamics don't get in the way. So they did something really smart. They actually sat down and said, let's talk about why you deserve X amount of the company. So they're having this interview and some really interesting conversations occur. So you look at Gilgamesh, I think his Guilfoyle, Gilgamesh, that's from the Smurfs. Guilfoyle, he's talking about how he can only do a certain part of the technical aspects and that nobody else is superior to his coding skills. And that makes a lot of sense. So bang, we need that. This is an embarrassment of riches because normally when founders start, they don't have this much technical talent. And they've got Guilfoyle and Dinesh here, who both have different coding skills. So they're on the team, which is really great. And they're advocating for their slice of the pie and they want equity because this could be a unicorn, and having 10%, 20%, 30% of a unicorn that's worth $1 billion. Well, you can do the math. Even owning 10%, that's a pretty nice valuation. And an exit, if you own 10%, obviously that's $100 million. Now what happens is then we've got poor Big Head here and drinking the big gulp. You're going to see this. And he can't defend his role in the company. And everybody knows it. And he's kind of like, they call him the useless appendage, kind of like the appendix. And I think this is kind of sad. And it's a lesson that we can learn. One, just don't take for granted that your friends are going to be co-founders. But two, sometimes having friends is an important thing. And we're going to see this story kind of unfold. It plays a larger part in the story. But I like the process, well, at least kind of the spoof the process of actually sitting down, having some formal conversation to serve notice to the people, the gang, that we're going to treat this like a legitimate company. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So then we're going to continue on. And so Biggetti leaves. Big Head is going to leave the company. They're going to let him go. But all of a sudden he gets hired at Hooli as a big fat FU. and give him a big swanky job because they ended up stealing Jared. So the whole thing comes full circle, and he gets this job at Hulu, and all these shenanigans start to happen, which actually is a really important thing because, spoiler alert, Big Head ends up being kind of like a mole and starts explaining and gives up the information to Richard and Pied Piper that they are trying to reverse engineer his code and figure out what he did, and thus begins the competitive aspect between Hulu and Pied Piper. It's a David and Goliath type story, which is kind of like the founder story. Really what it is you're going up against these big companies with deep pockets, and you're competing against Google and Apple, and you're trying to carve out that slice of the pie and really find where is that gap or where is that opportunity to disrupt the big incumbents. So then Richard goes on this big, huge tear and lays down the law and becomes this big, there's this theme about him being an a-hole to the whole thing. He lays down the law, and then lo and behold, he goes to the bank and they ask him, I'm sorry, we can't deposit your check because the check is written Pied Piper and you don't have a bank account. At which point in time, or business bank account with the name Pied Piper, at which point in time I kind of do a face palm and I'm like, geez, the ineptitude. But it's an interesting theme here in terms of founders need to know their business, and it's kind of pretty realistic where founders don't even know how to incorporate, and there's all these questions. Should I incorporate an LLC? Is it a C corp? How do I get the trade names and protected and all that good stuff? And that's going to be a theme in the next episode, so we're going to look ahead a little bit, and that's them unwinding and trying to figure out. The next episode is called Articles of Incorporation, which kind of gives you an idea where we're going to go, just showing the business ineptitude of founders, which is interesting. So what exactly is the lesson here that we want to look at when it comes to cap table? So let me just pull up my trusty pen here and go, okay, so cap table, the important thing is illustrated by, let me tell you a story about defending the cap table. One time I had this co-founder, and this individual ended up getting 38% of the company. And there were other co-founders, and I wanted to make sure that one other co-founder, which was this person, was really contributing the most value compared to the majority co-founder. I want to make sure that we were equally incentivized. So I took my shares and equally divided it between me and this other co-founder, and we ended up kind of becoming minority co-founders. And then what happened was we got to this place where we needed more capital, and I got invited to an accelerator. We pitched an accelerator. We got invited, different things. And I said, I'm not going to raise any more money and go down this route because I know where this is going to go. I've been here before. We cannot defend our cap table because the 38% majority owner of the company was not contributing. So what's going to happen is I'm going to be sitting in front of these institutional investors, and they're going to say, okay, so this person owns 38% of the company, and what does this person do? And I had nothing to say whatsoever. And this happened before, where we went to China and we were getting investors, and the angel investor looked at the cap table, and this co-founder, the very same one, said, I would like a salary, and here's how much of the company I own. And they said, we don't need your type of position. We are not going to pay that salary. You can't justify your existence in this company. And that really turned everybody off from each other. And it was just bad news from there. And so I became pretty difficult. I said, I'm not going to raise money to the chagrin of the rest of the company until we can reconfigure the cap table. And I made some suggestions and different things like that. It did not go well, and I ended up leaving the company. And the company got locked down, or got locked up, or held ransom by people who owned the majority, this individual who owned the majority of the company. You don't want to be in this situation. And I've seen it so many times before. I've seen situations where a founder brings on all these partners, friends and family, and makes them co-founders and gives them, more shares. And then everybody's holding the company hostage, et cetera, because it seems really convenient and cheap to give away equity at that time. And it's not, and it can lead to major catastrophic disasters. So please be careful when working through your cap table and who your co-founders are. Now, there's a real simple solution on what to do with Big Head, and that is simply what's called vesting and cliffs. And this, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't explain this in the series because it gets a little complicated, but you can solve this problem by giving people vesting schedules and cliffs. Now, let me go back to the lesson that I explained, that when you are in a startup, there are two roles right in the beginning. There is technical, so you're either coding or you're in sales. You're talking to your users and you're trying to sell. Those are the only two roles that you need. Build something or sell it. Build something or sell it, back and forth. And the two need to work together if you have two co-founders. If you're lucky, you have one founder who can do both, but sometimes it's better to get a co-founder because startups are really hard and there's a lot of work, especially if you want to build a unicorn company, which is $1 billion valuated company. And so you can use something called vesting schedule and cliffs. And it's simple. And here's how it works. You simply say, all right, I'm going to give you, let's say, around even number 18. Sorry. Let me give you around 16% of the company. Okay. And what's going to happen is you're on a vesting schedule. You have to stay here and perform for a year before you get 1/4 of that. So it's a 4-year vesting schedule and you get 4% of the company. So on the year anniversary, congratulations, 4% of the company. And then every month after that, or every quarter, or sometimes you do annually, I don't recommend it, you can start to accrue the rest of the company. So every year after that, you get another 4% over the course of the year. And then what happens is you get 16%, but you have to be in the company for 4 years. If you leave the company 1 year before, or before the year is up, the first year, you get nothing. But if you've contributed and the company survives past a year, well, and you leave after the year, let's say you leave at 1 year and 1 day, well, you get 4% of the company because most likely you've earned it. And if you haven't earned it, then you're going to be fired before you leave anyway. So that's what the cliff is for, that if you don't make it past the year, you get nothing. And that prevents the co-founder from holding the company hostage and getting 16% of the company and leaving in 3 months and saying, haha, thanks. And then the cap table's messy and you're not going to look at it or investors aren't going to look at it, or investors look at it and they're going to say, this is a messy situation. I've seen many investors pass on a great investment. They say, we like the company, we like the deal, we like the founders, but the cap table is just too messy. And we don't see a way that it's going to work out really well. And there's a big liability to it. And in this case, in the previous startup, I agreed to a vesting schedule and the cliffs. And so did the other co-founder. This one co-founder who had injected the initial capital and really got kind of the board behind them, etc., did not go on vesting schedules or cliffs. And unfortunately, I take full responsibility because I was not strong enough as a CEO. I was only an initial angel investor, and I was not strong enough as a CEO, as they asked me to become the CEO later as the company really start to fail. And I was not strong enough. I should have been better at looking at it and seeing what could possibly happen and putting all this in order before I went into the company. I did not. Ended up in a really messy co-founder divorce and caused me emotional trauma, which is the reason I began listening to the podcast Startup Therapy, because I was dealing with emotional stuff and ended up joining up startups.com just for startup therapy to get that emotional support from other founders. So there you have the lessons that I would recommend when it comes to thinking about your cap table. It is a very serious issue, even though it's kind of played for a lot of jokes and everyone was like, who gets big head shares and, all this stuff. It is a serious issue. And it's interesting that it was brought up in this way. Things to think about. So stay tuned for the next episode. Like I said, it's called Articles of Incorporation and goes through kind of the mechanics and the legal things. Not the greatest episode, spoiler alert, but I'm going to try to make it interesting. Hope you catch me for the next episode. Put these out on a regular basis. We got a lot of content to go through, which is really great. And once again, join me. Go to the App Store or Google Play Store, download Social Popcorn. Just look up Social Popcorn. You can look at the app. It is an MVP form, so it's really rough, but the basics of this is this. You can watch a show and create asynchronous watch parties. In other words, you can just tap notes into it and then see what other people who watch the show have put in for notes. And so if you go and download and you type in Silicon Valley and you start watching it, you will see my notes right there. And like I said, on the screen, and you'll see the way that I am reacting to the show. You can put emojis in there. You see the timeline and everything like that. Really interesting way to watch a show together without having to be together at the same time. And for educational purposes and content, pretty entertaining. That's what I think. I hope that's something that could interest you. Join me on Social Popcorn. I'm going to keep referring to it. Like I said, you can just, I'm usually one episode ahead. You can go see my notes for the next episode and see how I react to it, and then come enjoy and watch these videos together. All right. Thanks for joining. That's Silicon Valley Season 1, Episode 2. Stay tuned. Join me in the next video. We'll keep going. Thanks again for watching.